The slam of my mailbox echoed across my yard like a gunshot. I flinched, my heart racing as I pulled out another envelope stamped with the dreaded Pinecrest Village HOA logo. It was never good news. My hands trembled as I tore it open. My stomach tightened when I read the words. Notice of violation. $55 fine. Immediate payment required. I almost laughed. $55? For what? My eyes scanned the notice. Offense. Grass exceeding height regulations by 0.5 inches. Half an inch. My breath left me in a rush. Half an inch? You gotta be kidding me. For a second, I stood there in the driveway, the evening sun sinking behind the houses in our picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. It wasn't so perfect up close, though, not with the HOA lurking like a pack of vultures. I turned my gaze across the street. Sandra Wilkins, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, and the HOA secretary, was standing in her front yard. She pretended to water her roses, but I saw the way her smug lips twitched when our eyes met. So it was her. I could practically picture her, ruler in hand, measuring my lawn while I was pulling 16-hour shifts at the hospital. I crumpled the notice in my fist, tossing it onto my growing pile of unpaid bills inside. Since my husband left 6 months ago, money had been tight. Too tight. Between mortgage payments, groceries, and my daughter Lily's asthma medication, I was barely keeping us afloat. Now the HOA wanted a cut, too. I called the HOA office first thing the next morning. Pinecrest Village, HOA. This is Carol. Hi. I just received a fine for my grass being half an inch too tall. That seems excessive, I said, keeping my voice steady. And I never got a warning. Carol sighed, clearly bored. We don't issue warnings anymore. The revised bylaws went into effect last month. What revised bylaws? The ones we emailed to all residents, she replied. I checked my spam folder that evening. Sure enough, a 47-page document sat buried between ads for weight loss supplements and Nigerian print scams. I skimmed through it and nearly choked. No warnings before fines. Increased HOA control over properties. New penalties for aesthetic violations. I hadn't signed anything, but there it was, buried under legal jargon designed to confuse homeowners. The HOA had just changed the rules overnight, and no one had noticed. The next day, my neighbor Marcus, a retired veteran, knocked on my door with his cane in hand. Evening, Rachel, he said, glancing towards Sanders' house like he was checking for spies. Wanted to warn you, Sanders' been on the warpath lately. I groaned. Let me guess, she got you too? Last week, he nodded. Trash, Kim was left out 4 hours too long. Cost me $75. I was speechless. Been worse since that new HOA president took over, Marcus muttered. Richard Walters, big shot real estate guy. Rumor is he's using our fines to pay for that fancy clubhouse renovation no one asked for. My pulse quickened. Could they even do that? I checked with my nephew. He's a lawyer. Some of this stuff might not even be legal, Marcus said. But fighting an HOA, that's a whole different beast. I stared at my unpaid bills on the counter. Lily's inhaler needed refilling. The HOA fines were just another knife to the gut. I wasn't about to give them a dime, but if I didn't, what would they do next? The answer came sooner than I expected. That evening, while Lily and I were watering our tiny backyard vegetable garden, my phone buzzed. HOA violation notice, $75 fine. My stomach dropped. Unauthorized garden structures. I gaped at the email. My garden? I had a few tomato plants and a small wooden trellis for cucumbers. What was unauthorized about that? Across the street, Sandra was watching from behind her curtains. My blood boiled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I researched HOA abuse cases and found story after story of people losing their homes, being harassed, and even having their utilities shut off. Could they do that here? I checked my HOA agreement, a document I had signed years ago without a second thought. Most of it was standard legalese. But then I found it. Paragraph 37. The board had the right to escalate consequences for unpaid fines, including suspension of services as deemed necessary. My chest tightened. I stared at the words, knowing they were deliberately vague. Would they actually go that far? I had a sinking feeling I was about to find out. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in ready for war. The community center was packed. About 20 neighbors sat in plastic chairs, whispering about fines and unfair rules. At the front of the room, Richard Walters sat like a king on his throne, slick back hair, expensive suit, fake politician smile. Beside him, Sandra held her clipboard, lips pursed like she'd smelled something rotten. The chair recognized as Rachel Thompson. Walters said when I raised my hand. I stood, my voice stronger than I felt. I'd like to discuss the new fine structure. Many of us weren't properly informed about the changes, and some fines seemed excessive. Sandra's eyes narrowed. Property values depend on consistent neighborhood standards, she said, like a robot program for control. I'm not asking for exceptions. I shot back. I want to know where our fine money is going. The room went dead silent. For a split second, Walters hesitated. Our financial records are available during office hours, he said smoothly. Great, I said. I'll stop by tomorrow. After the meeting, neighbors swarmed me, whispering about their own HOA horror stories. Ellen was fined for having a bird feeder. Miguel had to repaint his door because the color was too blue. Even Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived here for 30 years, got a violation for wind chimes. I had expected resistance. What I didn't expect was a movement forming right in front of me. That night, Sandra cornered me in the parking lot. You're making a mistake, Rachel, she hissed. No, I said, meeting her glare. I think you are. I had no idea that by morning, I would find out exactly how far the HOA was willing to go to keep their secrets buried, and it would make a half-inch of grass seem like nothing at all. The next day, I walked up to the HOA office with a clipboard, a pen, and a surge of determination I hadn't felt in months. I was ready to see what they were hiding. The sun bore down as I approached the double glass doors, only to be greeted by a taped sign. Office closed for emergency maintenance. Convenient. Too convenient. I stood there for a minute, fuming, then took out my phone and snapped a photo of the sign, timestamp included. If they want to play games, fine. I was documenting everything now. Back at home, I opened my laptop and started drafting a formal written request for the HOA's financial records. If they weren't going to let me in, I'd leave a paper trail long enough to choke their printer. Later that evening, as Lily and I watered our backyard garden, I caught movement out corner of my eye. Sandra was behind her curtain again, watching. Right on cue, my phone buzzed. Violation notice. $75 fine. Unauthorized garden structures. Repeat offense. I stared at the screen. This was no longer about enforcement. It was harassment. I showed the message to Lily, who frowned. Mommy, why does that lady keep spying on us? I knelt beside her. Because some people don't know how to be kind, sweetheart. But we're not going to let her scare us. What I didn't say was that the unease in my stomach had grown from a flutter into a knot, because I had a terrible feeling that this wasn't even close to the worst of it. The next morning, I opened my front door to grab the paper and nearly tripped over it. A thick, bright red envelope taped to the doorframe like a scarlet letter. Final notice. $130, due immediately. Failure to comply will result in escalated consequences under HOA Bylaw Section 12.3. I crumpled it in my hands, eyes scanning for any mention of what escalated consequences even meant. There was none, just more vague, threatening language wrapped in legal armor. I called the HOA line. After a 17-minute hold, I got Richard Walters himself. Ah, Miss Thompson, he said, voice smooth like oil. I was expecting your call. Why am I receiving escalating fines for things that weren't even violations a month ago? And what are these escalated consequences supposed to mean? Your fines are cumulative, he replied coolly. You've now been cited for initial lawn height, failure to pay within the grace period, unauthorized garden structures, and improper storage of recreational equipment. What equipment? I snapped. Your daughter's bicycle was left in plain sight for over 4 hours. Section 9.2 states that all recreational items must be kept out of public view. I was speechless. Her bike? She's 7 years old. You're not even pretending this is about neighborhood standards anymore. I said, the board has appointed compliance monitors to maintain uniformity. It's all perfectly within our rights. I drew a slow breath. Then I want a formal hearing with the full board. You'll have it, he said, next Tuesday. But I suggest you bring your checkbook. I hung up, shaking. This wasn't regulation enforcement. It was psychological warfare. That evening, as I paced in the kitchen trying to figure out what to do next, a knock came at my back door. It was Amir, my neighbor from 2 doors down. Sorry to bother you, he said quietly, glancing toward the street. I overheard some of what's been happening. I'm an attorney, and I've handled cases like this before. You might want help. I almost collapsed into a chair. God, yes. I showed him the file I'd been compiling, violation notices, emails, timestamps, photos. He looked through them silently for a few minutes, eyes narrowing. This isn't enforcement, he said finally. This is targeted harassment and selective application of bylaws. And that clause they're leaning on for escalation? Extremely shaky. Can I fight it? I asked. You can, but you need to start building a case. Document everything. Record every phone call. Take dated photos of your property, daily. And don't go to the hearing alone. I'll help you prepare. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope crack through the storm cloud. 3 days later, I came home from my nursing shift exhausted, craving nothing but a hot shower and cold leftovers. But the porch light didn't come on. I walked inside. Darkness. I flipped the switch. Nothing. My heart pounded. I checked the breaker box. Everything was fine. I called the power company. After navigating endless menus, a representative finally came on. Miss Thompson, your power was disconnected today at 3:12 p.m. per request of the Pinecrest Village HOA under the Utility Oversight Clause. I froze. They can't do that. They provided documentation citing paragraph 37 of your HOA contract. I didn't hear the rest. I was already thinking about Lily's medication in the fridge, the one that needed refrigeration to stay viable. I grabbed a cooler and ran to the freezer, stuffing ice into it, trying not to panic. I called the HOA office. No one answered. I tried Richard's line. Voicemail. Sandra? Straight to voicemail. I texted Amir. No reply. He was in court today. Panic clawed at my throat. Then I remembered. Jenna, HOA cut my power. Lily's meds will spoil. No warning. No one is answering. I need help. Her reply was instant. Stay calm. I'm coming. News van in 30 minutes. Don't tell them we're filming. I stood in my darkening kitchen, flashlight in one hand, anger replacing fear. They'd messed with my home, my dignity, and now, my child's health. This wasn't about a fine anymore. This was war. 30 minutes later, Jenna's Channel 7 News van rolled into my driveway. She jumped out, followed by a cameraman and a sound tech. This is insane, she said as she hugged me. We came to film a segment on summer heat safety. But this is a real story. As they set up, more neighbors began peeking from behind curtains, whispering from porches. Sandra was standing in her doorway, frozen, clutching her phone. She knew. Richard's silver Mercedes pulled up moments later, with 2 board members in tow, clipboard in hand, smug expressions on their faces. Miss Thompson, Richard called, stepping onto my property like he owned it. We're here for your scheduled inspection. Funny, I never got notice about that. I replied, voice calm. Jenna stepped forward. Hi, I'm Jenna Rivera from Channel 7 News. We're live in 2 minutes. Richard's face blanched. You can't film this. It's private HOA business. We're on a public street, Jenna replied, and we've been invited by the homeowner. She turned to me. You ready to talk on camera? I looked at my dark house, at the neighbors watching silently, at Lily's innocent eyes peeking from behind the door. I nodded. Let's shine a light on it. As the camera rolled and Jenna's live report hit the airwaves, the neighborhood came alive in a way I'd never seen before. It was as if the flick of that red, recording light not only shined on the HOA's abuse, but also ignited something in people's hearts. More neighbors drifted onto my lawn, no longer hiding behind curtains. They weren't just curious, they were furious. Mrs. Jenkins, usually timid and reserved, stepped into the camera frame. "They fined me $200 for having the wrong shade of white on my Christmas lights," she said, voice shaking with both rage and relief. Jason, the father from a cul-de-sac, added, "I got fined $100 for hosting a Little League pizza party for my son's team. They called it an unauthorized gathering." It was a snowball effect. Story after story poured out, some trivial, some horrifying, all revealing the same truth. This wasn't enforcement. It was systemic intimidation. When Fred, one of the HOA board members, publicly separated himself from Richard Walters, admitting he hadn't even seen most of the enforcement decisions, murmurs turned into gasps. The crowd was no longer just angry. They were mobilizing. That night, as the news clip began circulating online, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors and complete strangers who saw the segment. My inbox overflowed with horror stories from across the country. HOAs abusing power, crushing people under fines, ruining lives. But amid the digital chaos came a quiet knock at my door. It was Maria, my neighbor from 3 houses down, holding a thick file folder and a USB drive. "We found something," she whispered, eyes intense. Inside were bank statements, budget reports, and treasury memos she requested months ago, but had only now been delivered, likely in panic. Her husband, an accountant, had spent the evening analyzing them. The numbers didn't lie. Over $300,000 of HOA funds had been funneled into a company labeled Evergreen Solutions. But a quick check showed Evergreen Solutions didn't exist, except on paper. A shell company, registered under the name of Richard Walters' brother-in-law. The renovations, the increased administrative expenses, all fake. Maria looked me in the eye. "This isn't just mismanagement anymore. This is fraud." The very next evening, we held an emergency community meeting. The community center overflowed with people, some standing shoulder to shoulder, some sitting on the floor, all burning with purpose. Even those who had once stayed silent now came forward. Fear had given way to fury and action. Retired Judge Reynolds, who lived in the Blue House on Pine Court, was appointed moderator. A formal vote of no confidence was held. The board, Walter, Sandra, and Diane, was removed by near-unanimous vote. New interim board members were elected on the spot. Maria, Jason, Mrs. Jenkins, Judge Reynolds, and Mr. Patel. Then came the resolutions. A full audit of HOA finances by an independent firm. Permanent removal of the utility disconnection clause. Review and reimbursement of all unjust fines issued under the previous board. Transparency requirements. Monthly open book sessions and published financial summaries. As I stood in that crowd, hearing the motions pass with cheers and applause, I felt something click into place. It wasn't just a win. It was a transformation. The next morning, I awoke to surprise. Not another violation notice, but potted plant with a handwritten note. "For your garden, better days ahead. Love, the Johnsons." Outside, neighbors were gathering again, but not in protest this time. They came with gardening tools, paintbrushes, and wheelbarrows, working side by side on each other's yards, not out of fear of fines, but out of genuine camaraderie. Mrs. Jenkins taught children how to plant sunflowers. The Patels passed out fresh lemonade. Jason helped repaint Marcus' porch railing. Even Mr. Finnegan, the reclusive old man at the corner, was out pruning his roses for the first time in years. I stood on my porch watching, Lily at my side, and realized something profound. This is what a neighborhood should look like. Not surveillance and suspicion, not control and fear, but connection, humanity, help, hope. And the most ironic part? We were finally meeting all the landscaping standards together, joyfully, voluntarily. 6 weeks later, I found myself standing on a small stage at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our new community garden, built on land that was originally set aside for Walter's unnecessary HOA expansion office. Judge Reynolds handed me a pair of ceremonial scissors. "Some people rule with fear," he said. "Others lead with courage. Thank you for showing us the difference." The crowd applauded, and not just politely, wholeheartedly. Jenna was there, of course, filming follow-up coverage for a national broadcast. "You've sparked a movement," she said, smiling. HOA reform groups are springing up across the country. People are organizing, uniting, fighting back. You gave them the playbook. But I shook my head. "No," I said. "We did. Together." Later that evening, Sandra's house went up for sale. Her husband stopped by quietly, apologizing for everything. "She's getting help," he said. "We should have seen it sooner." I nodded, not with anger, just understanding. Some people get lost in control because they're afraid of connection. Now, our street buzzed with laughter and music, the scent of backyard barbecues, and the chatter of children racing bicycles and drawing chalk murals on the sidewalks. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I sat on my porch swing with Lily curled beside me, watching neighbors wave to one another across fences no longer guarded by fear. The lights inside my house hummed softly, a sound I'd never noticed before, but now appreciated more than words could say. That sound wasn't just electricity. It was power, real power, the power of community, of people, of light over darkness.